Our next talk is from JanetStemwedel.
So, thank you to Alan and Sander for inviting me to such an exciting conference and to speak with such eminent philosophers. I am glad that Angela reminded us that one of the things we learned yesterday was how much forgetting we do about who has come before us. So I'm going to talk about some of the other forgetting we're at risk of doing, and I don't know what we're going to decide we want to do about this, if anything, but I'm putting it on the table. So I'm going to be speaking about some of the philosophy of science that happens that maybe we don't notice because the target audience for it is not us. And part of, I think, what might be at stake here is how we think about what it means to do philosophy of science. So we've got, the metaphor of the iceberg, where we pay attention to what's at the tippy top, but everything that's under the waterline risks escaping our attention. And if we only pay attention to the philosophy of science that is captured in journal articles, in monographs, in curated anthologies and textbooks that are used to teach students, especially at the front end of a discipline. So I think Feigl probably maybe had more impact with his anthologies than some of the people editing them today might have. There are things we're going to miss, and I think it might be worth reflecting on some of the things we're going to miss. I want to put some cards on the table as we think about what we might be missing. I'm calling them premises, but I think they're true. One is that we need a more expansive view of what it is to do philosophy of science, or else we are at risk of making invisible the work of lots of people who we are training as philosophers of science, or who have been trained as philosophers of science. And it's worth noting that especially in the early years of this millennium, we have had help broadening that picture of what real philosophy of science might include, from organizations like the Society for Philosophy of Science in Practice, SERPOIS, which is the Consortium for Socially Relevant Philosophy of or in Science and Engineering, and the erstwhile Josephus, which is the Joint Caucus for Socially Engaged Philosophy and History of Science. It no longer exists because HSS and PSA are no longer co-located. I have loved the influence that all of these organizations have had on the kinds of work that it's felt okay to do, but it's also worth noting that we're still largely focused here on audiences of academic philosophers. And there's other kinds of folks in the world besides us. My second premise is, in the same way that people in this room have noticed that material conditions matter to scientific practice, they also matter to philosophical practice. So what kind of philosophy of science it is possible to do is going to depend on things like, do you have research funding? Do you have a heavy teaching load? Do you have an academic job at all, as a matter of fact? All of these things matter, and to imagine that every place that philosophy of science is done has material conditions like the places most of us were trained to do philosophy of science is an idealization that I don't think helps us. And my third premise is, if the institutional structures and the, in scare quotes, real philosophers of science in those institutional structures are likely to overlook or undervalue your work, then your work ought to be in service of goals that matter to you. Right? If you're going to be at the margins, take advantage of being at the margins and go for something that's worth your effort as you understand it. Okay, so where is some of the action under the waterline on this iceberg that is work in philosophy of science? Well, one place actually came out near the end of yesterday's portion of the conference when Philip Kitcher was interviewed and mentioned Abusing Science, his popular science book about what was going on with the creationist discourse. Its audience was not philosophers of science per se. Its audience was maybe teachers or people on school boards or people trying to understand what was going on. That's the only book on this slide that's from the last millennium. More recently, Maya Goldenberg's Vaccine Hesitancy, which I don't know if it's strictly speaking, it was positioned as a popular book, but it really reaches a popular audience very well. It makes philosophy of science really accessible in an issue that matters to a lot of people with immune systems. And then I included 2 other books that are not by philosophers of science per se, but I would argue are doing some philosophy of science in them. One is Rebecca Skloot's book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Skloot is officially a science journalist, but she runs in a crowd of science writers and science journalism professors who are influenced by philosophers, including one at MIT running the science writing program who hung out with Hillary and Ruth Anna Putnam. So the philosophy gets in and then it gets out to the audience. Pests by Bethany Brookshire, an amazing recent book about how we draw the lines between animals that belong places and animals that don't belong places, is doing philosophy of science in a way that's really accessible to a general audience. Brookshire officially is a science writer. She used to be a pharmacologist, but she was an undergraduate philosophy major. So another huge piece of philosophy of science that we should recognize below the waterline is the teaching of philosophy of science, including at institutions where philosophy of science is a general education course, often one that fulfills the science requirement. I teach at such an institution. A lot of the audience for our philosophy of science class is people who need to fulfill that science general ed area and are terrified of science. And what they know about philosophy is it's in the humanities. So they assume it's going to be warm and fluffy. Oops. But we do our best. And the general education area learning outcomes that we are organized around are things like recognizing what makes science different from things that are not science, is something like a demarcation line. Understanding how scientists explain things. Understanding what the limits of scientific explanation are. These are all things that I want other people sharing a world with me to understand so they will make better choices, not only about themselves, but about the world they share with me. And philosophy of science courses, at least at my institution, do a better job explicitly addressing the area learning outcomes. It's harder in like a straight-on chemistry course to pull back and talk about the difference between science and pseudoscience. That's not really the agenda that most science professors have in their heads. What other kinds of work are philosophers of science doing below the waterline? One is supporting scientists in various ways. So this is the kind of thing that maybe happens at your institution when people in a science department are going up for a grant that explicitly requires an interdisciplinary team. And they say, oh crap, who's available? Who could I get? Well, if there's philosophers who are somewhere on someone's radar as being interested in how science works, in how modeling works, representation, whatever it is that has a way in. Often we need an ethicist on the team. Well, guess what? Those of us who work in values and science know a little bit about how the values that include how you engage ethically with your fellow scientists, with your experimental subjects, with the broader public, fit into proper scientific practice. So being the ethics person on the team is a great way to get to know a scientist and to actually support scientific research. There are also many scientific degree programs or planning grants where there is an expectation either from the funding agency or the accrediting agency that there is some relevant ethics support for the students. And this is a place where I think a philosopher of science actually maybe has an edge over plain vanilla ethicists. No shade on ethicists. I love ethicists. But understanding how scientific knowledge building works is extremely salient to how you tell the story to science students and science practitioners about why being ethical should matter to them. There is a particular example I wanted to call out of philosophy of science, a little bit below the waterline, that Josephus highlighted back when we were doing trading card events at the co-located PSA HSS meetings. So Michael O'Rourke and collaborators had an NSF-funded project called the Toolbox Project that involved using tools from philosophy to sit down with interdisciplinary collaborators and help them get on the same page and talk the same language. Amazing. Can you do that without a good philosopher of science person in the room? Maybe, but it's probably harder. And then there's a particular place that philosophy of science has happened below the waterline that I have some personal involvement in, and that is science blogging. So back near the beginning of the millennium, we had these things called blogs. Nowadays, people I think are mostly using Substack. It's the same idea. You write a thing, people on the internet find it, they're able to link it, they're able to comment on it. It was an opportunity to write about science philosophically online in a space where you could get feedback almost immediately. When I started doing this, I shared an office with a senior colleague who was gobsmacked that I had put a thing up one morning and within 20 minutes I had good comments showing up on the post. He said, what is that? He was used to, you send a thing to a journal, you hope you hear back from the journal while you still remember what it was you were arguing when you sent it to them. You hope the referees say something useful, but it's not the same kind of back and forth interaction, communication that you can get in a science blog or any kind of blog. Why I emphasize science blogging is the communications that happened, the community that rose up in the early 2000s of scientists, of science writers, of science students, and people with strong views about science of various sorts, just created a real opportunity to sort of get to know scientists and what they were doing, to talk about the science that hadn't yet calcified because they were still working it out, and to develop relationships, not just to make arguments, but to cultivate networks of trust where people could decide that maybe you were worth listening to and maybe you were worth asking questions, because it seemed like maybe you knew some stuff about science. And beyond having this two-way communication channel rather than doing the one-way sage on the stage proclamation of your philosophical views, it became an easier way to find scientists who were already up for a conversation rather than poking around the science departments in your own institution, hoping someone had the bandwidth for a communication. And again, these communities, they were real communities that rose up where there were real relationships of trust. And you didn't even necessarily have to have a blog. You could start out as a commenter on other people's blogs. And that was a way to gain trust. And once you have someone who's trusting you enough to talk to you, you can start talking back and maybe make some progress. So how could blogging amount to doing philosophy of science or advancing philosophy of science? Well, there were a lot of conversations with scientists about their work that ended up engaging those scientists in philosophical reflection of various sorts. Maybe reflection about their methodology, maybe reflection about how do you sniff out the stuff in your field that maybe isn't as science-y as you think it should be. How do you turn that kind of critical attention on your own work? It was also an amazing window to learn about not only the cutting edge science that was happening, but the size and shape of the workaday science from practitioners. In the same way that just focusing on the brand new, the revolutionary theories doesn't tell you everything you want to know about how science works. Just being able to witness in real time scientists reflecting on the rhythms of their own daily work was useful information for a philosopher of science who wanted to really understand scientific practice in a deep way. And these relationships of trust that you could build by engaging with people in your own comment section or engaging in other people's comment sections or cross-linking to other blogs, maybe made it so that scientists would start to develop a more complex view of what philosophers were like and what philosophers of science might have to contribute that they would be interested in. Yeah, so I was winning trust from scientists for you. You're welcome. And what happens when a philosopher earns a scientist's trust? Well, and the print here is too small, but I just pulled out a bunch of things from my CV that never would have happened if I had not maintained a blog that was regularly trafficked by scientists. I was speaking to information scientists. I was speaking to the American Association for Laboratory Animals. I was speaking at the Berkeley Museum of Paleontology about paleontologists behaving badly. I got to speak with the science communication crowd. I was at a workshop on the evolving culture of science engagement that included as its other invited participants, and I was an invited participant too, Ira Flato from Science Friday, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and the GZA from the Wu-Tang Clan. Tell me how else that would have happened in my career. Can't be done. So does this kind of work in philosophy of science matter? And this slide has the angels on my two shoulders. One is Mahatma Gandhi saying, you must be the change you wish to see in the world. The other, for fans of Succession, you will recognize as Jerry Kellman asking, how does it serve my interests? These are both good voices to have in your head. Let me go back to my third premise. If the institutional structures and the real philosophers of science in those structures are likely to look at my work and undervalue it, or worse, to not look at my work at all, then I better be spending my time on this earth doing work that I think matters. And I think it matters if scientists get more reflective about their work. I think it matters if the general public understands science in its complexity better than they do right now. And I think it's better if the people doing science, the communities doing science, look more like the bigger world that they're drawn from. So a fun fact from the social studies of science, the scientific fields that have the highest proportion of students and practitioners from historically underrepresented groups are also the ones where those underrepresented minorities see ways that the field provides them with tools that they could use to help the communities they come from. I don't think this is only true for science. I think this is true for the philosophy of science too. So if we are serious about being a subfield of philosophy where we can attract colleagues who look more like the student bodies we're teaching, then we need to think about what kind of tools we are offering people, not just to get high-profile publications in our best journals, but to make their world better, to help the communities they come from, whether that's by supporting public understanding of science, supporting more ethical scientific practice, supporting participatory science or citizen science, making scientific communities more inclusive and less biased, supporting scientists' epistemic humility, maybe even, improving things like science policy, science education, and so forth. If we can make these tools visible to our students who are our potential future colleagues, and if we can start valuing the important things in the world that people are doing with the tools from philosophy of science, then I think we win. So the too long didn't read is there's lots of philosophy of science being done in the world, but if you're not its intended audience, you might not notice it. Not noticing it, though, doesn't mean it's not making a real impact. Thank you. I almost left time.
Questions?
Get Heather.
Thank you so much, Janet. That was just lovely. I was wondering about your third premise.
Okay.
And I was wondering if it really needs that if clause in front of it.
Oh.
Shouldn't your work be in the service of goals that matter to you, regardless of whether the if part is true?
Hard agree, but I think I might need a longer argument to sell that to some people in the room, perhaps even people on the tenure track in the room.
How about because life is short? Work situations are precarious?
I believe that. I believe that. But again, young people might need more of an argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all.
Okay.
Sort of dovetails nicely with the previous question. So the obvious structural question is that, you know, all this work is definitely certainly valuable, but institutionally, you know, it's not always rewarded or legible. So do you have any thoughts on how
to make it so?
Yeah.
Well, I think part of this happens when philosophers of science become university administrators, which is a thing that can happen, because then you get to start saying, well, look, some of this work that's not currently valued actually does align with that mission statement and that value statement we've got on our university website. So why don't we start developing policies, let's say, for recognizing the value of socially engaged research or community, service to the broader community that is driven by our scholarly interests, by what we know because of how we were trained as academics.
Yeah, thanks. I'm thinking about the idea that one of the publics we're teaching to are students, and that really resonates with me, as someone who teaches large lecture courses. And I think ideally we would have a class that's sort of directed towards, philosophy of science more generally at the introductory level. But let's say there isn't one, you can't get one on the books. But you're teaching a intro to philosophy class, introducing students to philosophy more generally. Do you have any thoughts about what sort of philosophy of science topics that would be interesting in that context for a student? Because you have maybe 1 week or 2 weeks to really sort of get something across. Yeah.
Right, yeah. I would go in on objectivity. I always go in hard on objectivity. One of my favorite interactions with scientists online has been turning them on to Longino's 1990 Science is Social Structure, and in particular, her argument there about where objective knowledge comes from to the extent that we have it at all. So I think boiling down, grabbing a piece of her chapter on that, or maybe sort of pointing to that as connecting to much larger arguments, which are interesting and which you'll definitely want to follow up on when you take our department's philosophy of science course. But then saying, look, the important thing here that I want you to understand that philosophy of science can give you more details on is objectivity is not the property of an individual. It is the result of communal effort.
Holly?
Thank you. I'm totally on board with all this, and I think this is really great. And I kind of wanted to follow up on Heather's question a little bit, because I was just talking to some of my colleagues at different levels about this. And it's true that you really need to do sometimes things to get tenure. But then also, by the time you get tenure, you're often so in a groove that you just keep going on that groove of doing the things to get, yeah. And do you really need this publication here versus some other thing over here? So do you have anything to say about how you would get off that kind of track? Use the moment of now you have tenure as an opportunity to reevaluate other sorts of things? So I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, maybe it's that I came to philosophy of science a little bit later than I might have, that I already felt like there was a ticking clock. I had already seen some people saying that they were going to fly under the radar to get tenure and then pull the mask off, and discovering the mask was firmly attached at that point. So my advice is to do enough of the stuff that will get you tenure to give you cover to do the stuff that really makes you feel like you're improving the world. I don't think there's any way around that. You've got to find a way to do both, and having the cover from the real stuff, the stuff that's certified, is important. To do something new and interesting will sometimes lead to weird situations where your department chair says, really, your tenure dossier needs to have a chapter on your blogging. Yeah, which is a very strange thing, since I started blogging under my own name when noted natural philosopher Sean Carroll didn't get tenure at University of Chicago, and it was hypothesized that his very public blogging might have had something to do with that.
Hello, Janet. Ooh, sorry. Excellent, fabulous. I guess I have just a couple of things to say to invite you to say more. One of which is, if you are lucky enough to have a job at a university that has a faculty union, getting involved with your faculty union, especially on the bargaining committee, because there you have the direct opportunity to speak to your university about what counts as research, what counts as service, what counts as teaching, and you're not going to get what you want, at least not the first 3 times, but you keep having that conversation, and they know what the concerns are, and they sometimes actually share them. I guess the other thing I wanted to say, and I guess I just invite your further thoughts on this. Some of us are happy enough to work at places with graduate programs, and my philosophy department is involved in a science and technology studies program. But there is, in philosophy, and I invite us all to think about this, a deep desire to find our own field much more rigorous and important than every other field. We condescend to everyone else outside of science. So our STS students are coming from English, they're coming from sociology, they're coming from history. The only department that routinely does not admit those students into their graduate courses is my department, because my colleagues keep saying, you guys don't know enough to take a graduate course in philosophy. Everyone else in every other department allows a student in philosophy to come and take their graduate courses. So I guess, how did we get to the point where we decided that we're difficult studies, as one of my colleagues called it, and everything else is easy studies inside of social science and humanities? And how can we change the attitudes of ourselves and our own colleagues?
That's a lovely question. I have some thoughts. One thought is maybe the courses are too hard for those students because we're not teaching them well, or because we're assigning philosophers that had important thoughts that they were incapable of expressing clearly in writing. I think we're allowed to call that out. Another thing is we might note to our colleagues that fields that present themselves as very, very rational and very, very meritocratic, including, not just scientific fields, but also academic philosophy, are also fields that have a large amount of bullying and gender discrimination and racial discrimination. And if that's who our colleagues want to be, well, that's an interesting choice, right? So we might think about what the stakes are of cranking the gatekeeping too far up. Is that really creating a better situation for the output of our field? Is that going to bite us in the butt when enrollments start falling off because the people who remind us of ourselves when we're grad students are in short supply?
So that actually, I just have a comment, and that actually folds right into the comment, which is, well, it's certainly true historically that there have been a lot of problems. I mean, there was arguments, for example, that Sagan was not allowed into the National Academy because of Cosmos, But in the last 5 to 10 years, the science departments have been changing. So what you find now is most tenure documents in the vast majority of science departments have a specific engagement. We no longer call it outreach because, of course, it's now dialogue component. And in fact, that engagement component is an important part of tenure. And both the NIH and NSF have explicitly argued and, in fact, explicitly defined what they want to see as products on your CV, not publications. And while publications certainly count, but software, but also blogging and public engagement all count now. And so I'm just, as a comment, it might be worth looking to those science departments as a model for somewhat success. And particularly there are several in the last half decade or so that really have changed.
Yeah, the broader impacts thing and getting scientists through the grumbling that came the first few years on the grants, that those were a new requirement, I think has been very, very productive. And I think it would be good for philosophers to think about what kind of broader impacts do we want our field to have on the world besides making them think philosophers are jerks of various sorts.
It would be a great model to look historically, given we're talking history of science, at the broader impacts, because when they were first introduced, everybody said, I include undergrads in my lab, and that flew. And now that doesn't fly at all. If you do that, you're toast.
Yeah. Although my one caveat is that broader impacts are still a thing that's sort of tracking an academic environment. So again, if we just think about the proportion of college students in the United States who are taking philosophy at places with PhD programs versus taking philosophy at four-year comprehensives versus taking philosophy at community colleges. If we really want to reach community colleges is where we should be selling our wares, right? So we have to think pretty differently about what it means to get our work out if we think it's more important to have more than just the other people in the room here with us know about that work. And with that, I think I've used up my time.